July 20th, 1944. The conference room at the Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Lieutenant Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg adjusted his leather briefcase beneath the heavy oak map table, positioning it carefully near Hitler's feet. The air inside the wooden barracks was thick with summer heat and the smell of paper maps freshly unfurled across the surface. Hitler leaned forward, studying Wehrmacht positions along the Eastern Front, his fingers tracing retreat lines that now defined Germany's war. Around him, 24 officers stood shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space, their uniforms dark with sweat, their faces reflecting the exhaustion of 3 years spent watching their nation's military collapse. Stauffenberg excused himself, citing an urgent phone call from Berlin. No one questioned the one-eyed, one-handed colonel as he slipped through the door. At 12:42 p.m., the briefcase detonated. The blast tore through the room with a force that shattered windows and collapsed part of the ceiling. 4 men died instantly, but when the smoke cleared and rescuers pulled Hitler from the wreckage, he was standing, his hair singed, his trousers shredded, but alive. What appeared to be an isolated act of desperation was actually something far bigger, the culmination of years of military resistance, a coordinated coup attempt that had infected the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht and threatened to decapitate the Nazi regime in a single afternoon. The war's most infamous assassination attempt had just failed, but Operation Valkyrie was already in motion across Berlin, and for the next 6 hours, the fate of Nazi Germany would hang in the balance as conspirators raced to seize power before Hitler could reassert control. The roots of the conspiracy stretched back 6 years before that briefcase exploded. February 1938, the Benler Block, Berlin. General Ludwig Beck sat in his office reviewing Hitler's war plans for Czechoslovakia, his hands trembling as he read projections that showed Germany facing Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, all at once. Beck had served as chief of the Army General Staff since 1935, a Prussian officer of the old school who believed in honor, duty, and strategic calculation. What he saw in Hitler's directives violated all three. The Führer was gambling with Germany's existence based on intuition rather than military science. Beck drafted memorandum after memorandum that summer, warning that Germany lacked the resources for the wars Hitler envisioned. His arguments were ignored. In August 1938, Beck resigned in protest, the first crack in the Wehrmacht's facade of loyalty. But resignation was not resistance. Other officers noticed Beck's departure and understood its meaning. Colonel Henning von Treschow returned from the invasion of Poland in October 1939 with questions that would not quiet. He had witnessed SS Einsatzgruppen executing Polish civilians by the hundreds. Operations conducted with Wehrmacht logistical support. The murders continued in France, then exploded into systematic mass killing when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Treschow served as operations officer for Army Group Center, positioned to see everything. By December 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow before the winter counteroffensive threw them back with catastrophic losses. Treschow began recruiting quietly among officers who shared his doubts. Major General Henning von Treschow, Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Lieutenant Fabian von Schlabrendorf. They spoke in careful euphemisms about removing Hitler from command. Each conversation a test of loyalty and nerve. The turning point came at Stalingrad. Between November 1942 and February 1943, the Wehrmacht lost an entire army, 300,000 men killed or captured because Hitler refused to authorize retreat. Officers who had tolerated Hitler's strategic intuition now faced its full cost. The resistance network expanded. Beck became the elder statesman, Treschow the tactical organizer. They needed someone willing to carry the bomb. Claus von Stauffenberg had lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand to a strafing attack in Tunisia in April 1943. He spent months in hospitals, learning to dress himself, to write with 3 fingers. By late 1943, he had recovered enough to return to duty as Chief of Staff to the commander of the Reserve Army. His injuries gave him access to Hitler without arousing suspicion. A decorated war hero, visibly wounded in service, loyal. The conspirators had attempted assassination twice before Stauffenberg joined them. In March 1943, Treschow and Schlabrendorf placed a bomb on Hitler's aircraft during a visit to Army Group Center headquarters. The device failed to detonate. In November 1943, another officer volunteered to detonate explosives during a ceremony at the Sorghaus Museum in Berlin. Hitler left early. Each failure taught the same lesson. Half measures would not work. The assassin would need to be close enough to guarantee success, which meant close enough to die. Stauffenberg understood this when he volunteered in September 1943. He had 3 fingers and 1 eye. It would have to be enough. But even a successful assassination would mean nothing without a plan to seize power in the chaos that followed. The explosives arrived through channels that could never be fully documented. Wehrmacht intelligence had captured British plastic explosives during operations in North Africa and the Eastern Front, stockpiling them for demolition work. By early 1944, packages of this material found their way to the conspirators through sympathetic officers in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. The plastic explosive came in rectangular blocks wrapped in brown paper, each weighing about 1 kilogram. Unlike traditional dynamite or TNT, the British composition was stable, moldable, and devastatingly powerful. 2 blocks, properly fused, could collapse a reinforced bunker. Stauffenberg received his first package in March 1944. He studied the material with the clinical detachment of a man calculating his own death. The fusing mechanism presented the real challenge. The conspirators obtained pencil detonators, British-made time-delay fuses designed for sabotage operations. Each device consisted of a thin copper tube containing a glass vial of corrosive acid. When the user crushed the copper cap, the acid ate through a restraining wire. Once the wire dissolved, a spring-loaded striker hit the percussion cap, detonating the explosive. The delay depended on the acid concentration and wire thickness. A 10-minute fuse at room temperature, 15 minutes in cold weather. The conspirators selected the 10-minute variant. Stauffenberg would need to arm the device, place it, and exit the building before detonation. 10 minutes was barely enough. The process required both hands. Stauffenberg had 3 fingers on his left hand. The thumb, index finger, and middle finger remained functional. His right arm ended at the wrist. He practiced the arming sequence in his quarters late at night, using dummy explosives and deactivated fuses. The technique required crushing the copper cap with pliers held in his 3-fingered left hand, while steadying the fuse with his right forearm. Each practice session confirmed what he already knew. He could arm 1 bomb in about 3 minutes under ideal conditions. 2 bombs would require at least 6 minutes, assuming no interruptions, no dropped tools, no fumbling with equipment. The mathematics were unforgiving. If he attempted to arm both packages and ran out of time, the entire operation would fail. If he armed only 1 package, the explosive force would be halved. British testing data suggested 2 kilograms of plastic explosive with proper placement could kill everyone within a 5-meter radius. 1 kilogram was a gamble. By July 1944, Stauffenberg had attended multiple conferences at Hitler's headquarters, carrying unarmed explosives in his briefcase each time, waiting for the right moment. The security protocols varied. Sometimes he could access a private room before the conference, sometimes he could not. On July 15th, he traveled to the Wolf's Lair with both explosive packages and full intent. But Himmler was absent from the conference. The conspirators had agreed that both Hitler and Himmler needed to die simultaneously to ensure the coup's success. Stauffenberg did not arm the bombs. He returned to Berlin. 5 days later, on July 20th, he received orders to attend another conference at the Wolf's Lair. This would be the last opportunity. The Allies were advancing in Normandy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Time had run out. The morning of July 20th, Stauffenberg armed 1 bomb, just 1. His adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Haften, carried the 2nd package separately. They would arm it if time permitted, but time never permitted anything. At the Wolf's Lair, Stauffenberg requested permission to change his shirt before the conference, a reasonable request given the summer heat and his injuries. An aide led him to a nearby washroom. He had perhaps 3 minutes of privacy. Haften handed him the pliers. Stauffenberg positioned the fuse, crushed the copper cap, heard the quiet crack of breaking glass. The acid began eating through the restraining wire. He placed the armed bomb in his briefcase and closed the clasp. The second bomb remained with Hafton, inert and useless. The conference room was waiting, and the clock was already counting down. The briefcase weighed 3 kilograms, 1 kilogram of British plastic explosive, 1 kilogram of fusing mechanism and packing material, 1 kilogram of documents to justify its presence. Stauffenberg carried it in his left hand as he walked from the washroom toward the conference barracks at 12:32 p.m. Acid eating through wire inside the detonator at a rate of 1 millimeter every 90 seconds. He had 8 minutes remaining. The security checkpoint required him to open the case. The guard glanced at the papers inside, saw nothing unusual, waved him through. The chemical reaction continued undisturbed. The conference room measured roughly 4 meters by 15 meters. A wooden barrack structure with windows along both long walls, a single heavy oak table dominating the center. 24 officers stood around that table when Stauffenberg entered. Hitler occupied the middle of the long side, facing the windows, his back to the solid wall. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood to Hitler's right. General Adolf Heusinger stood directly across from Hitler, using a large map to brief the Führer on the deteriorating situation along the Eastern Front. The windows were open. Outside temperature hovered near 28 degrees Celsius. The confined space amplified every sound, every movement. Stauffenberg positioned himself near Hitler's end of the table, placing his briefcase on the floor beneath the table's overhang, about 2 meters from Hitler's feet, the optimal kill radius for 1 kilogram of plastic explosive. He pushed the case slightly under the table with his foot, ensuring it rested against the thick wooden support leg that anchored the table's structure. 6 minutes remaining. Colonel Heinz Brandt, Heusinger's chief of staff, stood next to Stauffenberg's position, leaning over the table to examine the map. The briefcase occupied space where Brandt needed to stand. Without asking, without thinking, Brandt reached down and moved the briefcase to the opposite side of the table leg, placing the heavy oak support directly between the explosive and Hitler. The movement took 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds would determine the next 6 years of European history. Stauffenberg remained motionless, unable to move the case again without drawing attention. He checked his watch. 4 minutes. He caught Keitel's eye and whispered that he needed to take an urgent phone call from Berlin. Keitel nodded. Stauffenberg walked out of the conference room at 12:37 p.m. At 12:42 p.m., the restraining wire dissolved completely. The striker hit the percussion cap. 200 grams of RDX high explosive detonated with a velocity of 8,000 meters per second, generating a pressure wave that exceeded 20,000 pounds per square inch at the point of origin. The blast propagated outward in a spherical pattern, encountering the oak table leg first. The thick wood absorbed and deflected a significant portion of the explosive force upward and away from Hitler. The remainder of the energy traveled through the table's surface, shattering wood, lifting the entire structure into the air, blowing out every window in the barracks. Colonel Brandt, standing directly over the briefcase when it detonated, died instantly. So did General Gunther Korten, chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe. So did General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant. So did stenographer Heinrich Berger. 20 others suffered injuries ranging from severe to minor. Hitler stood up. His hair was singed. His trousers hung in shreds. His right arm was bruised. His eardrums were damaged. But he was standing, conscious, and alive. The table leg had saved him. Stauffenberg, 300 meters away when the explosion occurred, saw the barracks erupt in smoke and flame. He saw bodies carried out. He saw chaos. He assumed, as any rational observer would assume, that no one inside that room could have survived. He proceeded to the first checkpoint, bluffed his way through by claiming emergency orders from Keitel. He reached the second checkpoint, repeated the performance. He reached the airfield, boarded his aircraft, and departed for Berlin at 1:15 p.m., convinced that Adolf Hitler was dead and that Operation Valkyrie could proceed. But in the ruins of the conference room, Hitler was already speaking, already giving orders, already preparing his response. The conspiracy had detonated successfully. The target had survived, and the coup that depended on Hitler's death was about to collide with the reality of his survival. General Friedrich Olbricht stood in his office at the Bendlerblock, Berlin, at 1:01 p.m. on July 20th, holding a telephone receiver and a piece of paper that would either save Germany or destroy everyone in the building. The paper contained the activation order for Operation Valkyrie, a legitimate contingency plan authorized by Hitler himself in 1943. Valkyrie's official purpose was to suppress internal uprisings by foreign laborers, communist cells, or SS units that might attempt a coup during moments of military crisis. Its provisions granted the Reserve Army commander authority to deploy troops, impose martial law, arrest suspects, and seize control of communications infrastructure. The conspirators had spent months subtly revising Valkyrie's language, inserting clauses that allowed them to arrest SS leadership under the guise of suppressing an SS putsch against the Wehrmacht. The irony was perfect. They would use Hitler's own emergency protocol to overthrow Hitler's regime. Olbricht issued the first Valkyrie order at 1 p.m., before Stauffenberg's aircraft had even landed in Berlin. The order went to Wehrmacht commanders across Germany and occupied territories. SS units have attempted a coup against the government. The Führer is dead. All SS and Gestapo offices are to be occupied immediately. Key personnel are to be arrested. Communications are to be secured. The Reserve Army is assuming executive authority until civilian government can be restored. Within 30 minutes, teletype machines across Europe were printing these instructions. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg commanded over 1,000 SS and SD personnel to be arrested by 11:00 p.m. local time. His forces moved with precision, occupying Gestapo headquarters, detaining SS Obergruppenführer Karl Oberg and every senior security official in France. The operation succeeded completely. In Vienna, similar orders went out with similar results. The elegance of Valkyrie lay in its duality. To officers uncertain about the conspiracy, it appeared to be a legitimate response to an SS threat. To true conspirators, it was the instrument of regime change. Colonel Merz von Kernheim, Olbricht's chief of staff, coordinated communications from the Bendlerblock, routing orders through military channels that the SS could not easily monitor or countermand. For 2 hours, the conspiracy controlled the narrative. But the plan contained a fatal assumption. Every Valkyrie order stated that Hitler was dead. This claim needed to be true. Without Hitler's death, the entire legal and psychological foundation of Valkyrie collapsed. Regional commanders would hesitate, demand confirmation, contact Berlin directly rather than obeying Reserve Army orders. By 3:30 p.m., contradictory information began circulating. Radio broadcasts from East Prussia reported an assassination attempt, but did not confirm Hitler's death. Some commanders received phone calls from officers at the Wolf's Lair stating that Hitler had survived. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army and Stauffenberg's direct superior, refused to sign Valkyrie orders after speaking with Keitel by telephone. Fromm knew Hitler lived. He ordered Olbricht to cancel Valkyrie. Olbricht refused. The Bendlerblock divided into factions. Some officers continued executing coup orders. Others began quietly distancing themselves, making contingency plans for what would happen if Hitler reasserted control. Stauffenberg landed in Berlin at 3:45 p.m. and drove directly to the Bendlerblock, still believing Hitler was dead. He found the conspiracy in motion, but losing momentum. He spent the next 7 hours on the telephone, attempting to convince regional commanders to continue the coup, insisting that Hitler was dead despite growing evidence otherwise. Some obeyed. Most hesitated. At 1 a.m. on July 21st, Hitler's voice came through every radio in Germany. His speech was brief, his tone furious. A small clique of ambitious officers attempted to eliminate me and seize power. The criminals will be crushed without mercy. I am unhurt and will continue my work. Within minutes, every Wehrmacht officer still executing Valkyrie orders understood the reality. The coup had failed, Hitler lived, and everyone involved in the conspiracy was now guilty of high treason. In Paris, Stauffenberg released the arrested SS officers and prepared his alibi. In Vienna, commanders claimed they had been following orders under false pretenses. In Berlin, loyalist officers led by General Otto Ernst Remer surrounded the Bendlerblock. The shadow government that had existed for 6 hours was about to be erased in 6 minutes. General Friedrich Fromm entered the room at 11:45 p.m. on July 20th, freshly released from the office, where conspirators had held him under guard for the past 8 hours. He understood his position immediately. The coup had failed. Hitler lived. Every officer in the Bendler block who had participated in Valkyrie faced execution unless someone could demonstrate zealous loyalty quickly enough to create distance from the conspiracy. Fromm convened a court-martial that consisted of himself. The trial lasted 15 minutes. He sentenced General Friedrich Olbricht, Lieutenant Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Haften to death for high treason. General Ludwig Beck, the moral architect of the resistance, requested permission to shoot himself. Fromm granted it. Beck raised a pistol to his temple and fired. The bullet grazed his skull. He remained conscious. A sergeant shot him in the neck. He died at 11:50 p.m. At 12:10 a.m. on July 21st, the 4 condemned men were led into the cobblestone courtyard outside the Bendler block. A Wehrmacht staff car provided illumination with its headlights. 10 soldiers formed a firing squad. No blindfolds were offered. Olbricht died first, then Haften, then Stauffenberg. As the rifles raised, Stauffenberg shouted his final words into the darkness. "Long live sacred Germany." The volley echoed off the stone walls. Merz von Quernheim died last. By 12:30 a.m., SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny arrived with Waffen-SS personnel and halted further executions. The remaining conspirators would face Hitler's preferred form of justice. Hitler wanted more than death. He wanted humiliation, terror, and spectacle. Over the shabby following weeks, Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo arrested anyone with the remotest connection to the plot. The initial investigation uncovered letters and diaries that revealed earlier conspiracy attempts in 1938, 1939, and 1943, triggering additional waves of arrests. By the time the purge concluded, over 7,000 people had been detained. Approximately 5,000 were executed. Many had never participated in any conspiracy. The regime's paranoia consumed military officers, civil servants, clergy, and aristocrats whose only crime was association with someone who had opposed Hitler years earlier. The centerpiece of Hitler's vengeance was the People's Court under Judge Roland Freisler. The first show trial began on August 7, 1944, in the Great Hall of the Berlin Chamber Court. The hall was decorated with swastikas. 300 spectators attended, including SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner and selected journalists. Behind Freisler's bench, a film camera recorded everything for Hitler's private viewing. The accused were denied belts and suspenders, so their trousers sagged. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, 62 years old, stood before Freisler holding his waistband while the judge screamed abuse. Witzleben managed one final statement before being silenced. "You may hand us over to the executioner, but in 3 months, the disgusted and harried people will bring you to book and drag you alive through the dirt in the streets." The trial lasted hours. The verdict was predetermined: death by hanging. The executions took place at Plötzensee prison. By Hitler's direct orders, military protocol was abandoned. No firing squads for traitors. The condemned were hanged with thin cord or piano wire from meat hooks, a method designed to prolong suffering. Some death struggles lasted 20 minutes. The executions were filmed. Witzleben died on August 8th. Stauffenberg's brother Berthold died days later by the same method. Hitler watched the footage repeatedly in his private quarters. According to post-war testimony from Albert Speer, the regime extended punishment beyond the guilty. Himmler invoked Sippenhaft, an ancient Germanic concept of blood guilt that held entire families responsible for an individual's treason. Nina Schenk, Gräfin von Stauffenberg, Claus von Stauffenberg's wife, was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. His brother Alexander, who knew nothing of the plot and was serving with the Wehrmacht in Greece, was also imprisoned. Karl Gordeler's family, Henning von Trescow's relatives, and dozens of other families lost homes, pensions, and freedom. The purge continued for months, meticulously documented, systematically brutal, designed not just to punish treason, but to eliminate any future possibility of military resistance. The conspiracy had lasted 6 hours. The retribution would consume the Wehrmacht's leadership for the remainder of the war. The Wehrmacht that existed on July 19, 1944, was not the Wehrmacht that fought the final 10 months of the war. The purge that followed the failed assassination removed not just conspirators, but an entire generation of professional officers whose primary loyalty was to Germany rather than to Adolf Hitler. The replacements were chosen for ideological purity rather than tactical competence. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front and peripherally implicated in the plot, was removed from command in August 1944. He committed suicide by cyanide on August 19th rather than face interrogation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most celebrated German commander in the West, was forced to take poison in October after his name appeared in interrogations, though his direct involvement remains disputed. Dozens of senior staff officers, corps commanders, and division commanders were arrested, tried, or simply relieved of duty under suspicion. The vacancies were filled with fanatical loyalists who understood that survival depended on unwavering obedience to Hitler's strategic vision. No matter how detached from military reality that vision had become. Officers who might have advocated tactical retreats to preserve forces and shorten defensive lines now knew that any suggestion of withdrawal could be interpreted as defeatism or treason. The result was a military leadership paralyzed by fear, unable to adapt to rapidly deteriorating circumstances on both the Eastern and Western fronts. At precisely the moment when Germany needed flexible, experienced commanders capable of conducting strategic defense against overwhelming Allied superiority, the Wehrmacht was led by men whose primary qualification was political reliability. The strategic consequences manifested immediately. In the East, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration in late June 1944, destroying Army Group Center and advancing 600 kilometers in 6 weeks. In the West, Allied forces broke out from Normandy in August, liberating Paris and driving toward the German border. The officers who might have organized coherent defensive strategies were dead, imprisoned, or too terrified to speak candidly about Germany's military situation. Hitler's August 31st order, mandating that no unit could retreat without his personal authorization, eliminated the last flexibility remaining in German tactical doctrine. Divisions were ordered to hold indefensible positions until they were encircled and destroyed, rather than conducting the elastic defense that might have prolonged resistance. The command structure itself deteriorated. Hitler's paranoia, always present, intensified after July 20th. He trusted no one, suspected everyone, and increasingly made decisions based on ideological fantasy rather than intelligence reports. His insistence on launching the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, despite every professional military assessment indicating that Germany lacked the fuel, ammunition, and reserves necessary for such an operation, consumed the last mobile forces that might have been used to defend the Rhine. The offensive failed within 2 weeks, and those forces were lost. The generals who might have argued against the operation more forcefully knew what happened to officers who questioned Hitler's judgment too insistently. The purge extended beyond command positions. The introduction of sip-and-half laws meant that officers at every level understood that their families would suffer if they were implicated in any resistance activity. This created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and surveillance within the Wehrmacht itself. Officers informed on one another. Political officers appointed by the Nazi Party monitored unit commanders. The cohesion and trust that professional military organizations require to function effectively dissolved. What remained was an army held together by terror, fighting not for victory, which everyone knew was impossible, but to delay the inevitable collapse long enough to avoid accusations of cowardice or treason. The conspirators had failed to kill Hitler, but in failing, they had achieved something unexpected. By provoking Hitler's paranoid purge, they had accelerated the very military collapse they had hoped to prevent through negotiated peace. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 and early 1945 was a shadow of the force that had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1942. Its best commanders were gone, its tactical flexibility was eliminated, Its soldiers fought under leaders chosen for loyalty rather than skill, executing orders that made no strategic sense, defending positions that could not be held, all because the alternative was to be labeled a traitor and face the consequences that had befallen Stauffenberg and thousands of others. The conspirators wanted to save Germany by removing Hitler. Instead, Hitler's survival ensured that Germany would be destroyed completely. The irony would have been almost poetic if the cost had not been measured in hundreds of thousands of additional casualties in the final months of a war that was already lost. The men who died at Plötzensee believed they were acting to preserve something of Germany's future. What they inadvertently ensured was that Germany would fight to absolute exhaustion, unconditional surrender, and total occupation by foreign powers. The coup that failed in 6 hours shaped the final chapter of World War II in ways its architects never intended and could never have predicted. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were rubble. Millions were dead. The nation that had conquered most of Europe in 2 years had been destroyed completely in 6. In the immediate aftermath, most Germans viewed the July 20th conspirators not as heroes, but as traitors who had violated their military oaths during wartime. The Nazi propaganda narrative, repeated endlessly, in the final months of the war, portrayed them as cowards and backstabbers who had tried to surrender Germany to its enemies. This perspective persisted even after Hitler's regime collapsed. Many Wehrmacht veterans, particularly those who had remained loyal to the end, considered Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators dishonorable officers who had betrayed their comrades while men were dying at the front. The concept of military honor in German culture held that soldiers obeyed orders regardless of personal moral qualms. By that standard, the conspirators had committed the ultimate military sin. The gradual rehabilitation of their memory began slowly in the early 1950s as West Germany struggled to construct a new democratic identity from the ruins of Nazism. The challenge was profound. How could a nation rebuild moral legitimacy when it had committed genocide and waged aggressive war across an entire continent? The answer required finding examples of German resistance to Hitler, proof that not all Germans had been complicit in Nazi crimes. The July 20th conspirators provided that proof. They were not communists or exiles. They were conservative military officers, aristocrats, civil servants, and clergy who had opposed Hitler from within the system itself. Their resistance offered a usable past, a moral foundation upon which democratic West Germany could be constructed. In 1952, the West German government officially recognized the July 20th conspirators as resistance fighters rather than traitors. The legal rehabilitation was followed by physical memorialization. The Bendler block, where Stauffenberg and his fellow officers had been executed in the courtyard, became the memorial to the German resistance in 1953. The cobblestones where they died were preserved. A bronze plaque marked the execution site with their names and final words. The building itself was converted into a museum, documenting all forms of resistance to Nazism, military and civilian, successful and failed. Streets across West Germany were renamed Stauffenbergstrasse. Schools bore the names of resistance members. July 20th became an official day of remembrance in the Bundeswehr. West Germany's new democratic military, the conspirators' moral legacy proved more valuable than any military victory they might have achieved. They demonstrated that resistance was possible even in a totalitarian state, that individuals could choose conscience over obedience, that military officers could recognize when their duty to the nation superseded their duty to the regime. This was not a comfortable legacy. It raised difficult questions. If Stauffenberg and Beck recognized Hitler's evil by 1944, why not earlier? Why did they participate in the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, the assault on the Soviet Union? The conspirators were not pacifists or Democrats in the modern sense. Many had supported Hitler's early territorial expansions. Their turn toward resistance came only when Germany's military situation became hopeless and atrocities could no longer be ignored. Yet their sacrifice retained profound symbolic weight. Stauffenberg's final words, "Long live sacred Germany," echoed across decades as a statement of principle that transcended the immediate failure of the coup. He had not shouted "Long live Hitler" or "Long live the Reich." He had invoked something older and more fundamental, a Germany that existed apart from Nazism, a nation worth dying for even when the regime controlling it was not worth defending. This distinction became central to post-war German identity. The Federal Republic constructed itself on the premise that German culture, history, and values could be separated from the 12 years of Nazi rule, that patriotism could exist without nationalism, that serving one's country sometimes required betraying one's government. The conspirators had lost. Hitler survived, the war continued, Germany was destroyed. But in losing, they preserved something essential. They proved that resistance had existed, that Germans had fought against Hitler from within, that the narrative of universal complicity was false. This proof became the moral cornerstone of democratic Germany's reconstruction. When the Bundeswehr was founded in 1955, its training emphasized that soldiers had a duty to refuse illegal orders, a direct legacy of July 20th. When German students studied World War II, they learned not just about German crimes, but also about German resistance. The conspirators' failure became a teaching moment, a reminder that courage sometimes means accepting certain death for uncertain outcomes, that honor sometimes requires treason, and that the highest form of patriotism is recognizing when your nation's government has become its greatest enemy. 70 years after the briefcase exploded at the Wolf's Lair, Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators stand as symbols of moral courage in the face of totalitarian evil. Their legacy is complicated, their motivations were mixed, and their plan failed catastrophically, but they acted when action seemed impossible, resisted when resistance seemed futile, and died believing they served a Germany worth more than their own lives. In the end, that belief, not the success of their coup, became their most enduring contribution to German history.